Matthew wrote this gospel to a Jewish audience primarily, and he writes to show that Jesus is the Messiah and King of the Jews that is promised in the Old Testament scriptures. In chapters 8 and 9, Matthew gives us a compilation of miracles that Jesus performed that show his identity and shows it very clearly that he's the Messiah. Also shows his deity. In verse 14, we're told that the disciples of John the Baptist came to Jesus with a question about fasting. Now, I think for many of us, we assume that when Jesus began his public ministry, that the disciples of John left following John and began following Jesus. But that's not entirely true. We see here that John still had disciples following him. In fact, in the book of Acts, chapter 19, so way past the Gospels, right? Acts chapter 19, Paul encounters disciples of John in the city of Ephesus. So John still had disciples that were following him. John at this point was in prison, and some of the disciples of John came to Jesus, and again in verse 14, they said, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast?" Now, just as a little side note here, for those of you that were here last week, in the previous section just above this, the Pharisees questioned Jesus about why he ate with sinners and tax collectors. And now the question is, why don't you fast? Right? Last week it's, why are you eating with these people? This week it's, why aren't you fasting? At this point, everything Jesus did was scrutinized. Even his eating habits, right? Oh, you're eating with these people. This week, it's, why aren't you fasting? Now, we've talked about fasting before, earlier in the Gospel of Matthew. Fasting essentially is when you deny your flesh of something to focus on the Spirit. Usually when a person fasts, they fast from food or from certain foods for a period of time, but you really can fast from anything. You can fast from the internet. You can fast from watching the news, which might be a good thing for all of us at this time. But again, it's just denying yourself of something, usually food, so that you can focus on the spiritual, so you can focus on prayer and seeking the Lord. Fasting sharpens our spiritual senses. Now, here's the thing. Listen, the law of Moses, remember, these are Jews. They're under the law of Moses. The law of Moses required fasting on one day of the year, the Day of Atonement. And that's recorded in Leviticus 16, verse 29, if you're taking notes. That's the only day of the year Jewish people were required by God to fast. Now, there were other occasions in the Bible when people fasted. For example, during times of national calamity, like when King Saul and his son Jonathan were killed in battle. We read in the Old Testament that the nation of Israel fasted after the death of their king. Daniel, the prophet, of course, fasted, sometimes called the Daniel fast. David fasted when his child was sick and dying. We read that David fasted. The Jewish people fasted as a nation in the book of Esther. In the New Testament, the disciples also fasted. So there are many occasions in the Bible when people fasted, but those fasts were all voluntary, by choice. They weren't required. The law required one day a year that people should fast. But look at verse 14 again. The disciples of John fasted often. We don't know how often. And the Pharisees fasted often. Now we know the Pharisees fasted twice a week. In Luke chapter 18, Jesus tells the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. The Pharisee says, "I fast twice a week." The Pharisees fasted every Monday and every Thursday of every week. And maybe John's disciples followed that same practice of the Pharisees and fasted twice a week. We don't know. So God required people to fast one day a year. Required. The Pharisees required people to fast 104 days a year, 52 times 2. And that's the requirement that they put on people. Now, notice the disciples of John asked Jesus two questions, really. Why do we and the Pharisees fast often? That's the first question. But your disciples do not fast. That's the second question. And if you notice here, Jesus doesn't answer the first question about why they fast so often. By being silent, it's almost as if Jesus is saying, I can't tell you why you fast so often. God doesn't require it. You tell me why you fast so often. He doesn't answer the first question, but he does answer the second question. In verse 15, Jesus said to them, can the friends of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. Jesus uses the imagery of a wedding here. And the imagery of a wedding is used often in the New Testament to describe Jesus' relationship to his church, with Jesus as the groom and the church as his bride. A wedding, as you know, is a time of celebration. It's not a time of mourning. It's not a time of fasting. If you were invited to a wedding and on the wedding invitation it said for the reception, we're going to spend the time praying and fasting, you're going to skip the reception. We'll just go to the wedding and then go out to eat or something. Right? A wedding is a joyous occasion with food and a DJ and, the cha-cha shuffle or whatever and the Cupid shuffle and all those stupid dances that we do at weddings. Jesus said here, do the wedding guests mourn when they are with the groom? And of course not. While Jesus is here on earth, it's a time to celebrate. But look at the end of verse 15. Jesus says, but the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. Now, this is a veiled reference to his death. And this is the first time Jesus makes reference to his death in the Gospel of Matthew. Later in the Gospel, he will get more specific and direct, especially the closer he gets to his crucifixion. In fact, in Matthew chapter 20, Jesus will make it very plain to his disciples. He will say, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and to scourge and to crucify, and the third day he will rise again. That's pretty clear. This is why Jesus Christ came from heaven to earth. This is what we just remembered through communion. Jesus Christ came to die on the cross for our sins. This was his purpose in coming. This was his mission, to offer himself as a substitute in our place, to die in our place. The disciples will sorrow and fast when Jesus is taken away and crucified. But their sorrow will be temporary, because on the third day he'll rise again from the dead. He'll be resurrected. So now when Jesus is with the disciples, now it's not the time for his disciples to fast. Now it's time to celebrate. By the way, the Bible tells us that one day the Lord will come for his church and take us all to heaven. And you know what we're going to do in heaven? We're going to have a great big feast called the marriage supper of the Lamb. We're going to have a big celebration, a wedding reception in heaven with Jesus.